Hi everyone, welcome to Digital Shift, where we discuss topics that will affect business, society and culture, as we want you to be better prepared for the future. If you see the shift coming, you can adjust to it. We've seen attitudes and mindsets changing regarding what the business is for. An often heard narrative is that the business is just for maximizing shareholder value. Now new companies are emerging with a business model built around a purpose. Hi Nick, welcome to Digital Shift. I'm June and this is Alan, and we would like to first ask you to introduce yourself.
Hi June and Alex, my name is Nick Beglinger. I'm 50 years old. I come from Zurich. I studied at the London School of Economics, became an economist, started work with McKinsey, first in Germany, then in China, did the first software joint venture in Vietnam, sold that, started working infrastructure, met Federal Council Leute to convince me to set up a business association in Switzerland, which I then did. The business association is called Swiss Clean Tech. So I started the foundation, launched Swiss Clean Tech, and run it as a president for 7 years. After the Paris Climate Conference, I decided that it's enough of a Switzerland focus. I spun off Swiss Clean Tech from our foundation, and I'm currently running the Clean Tech 21 Foundation for a few international projects. Our core mission continues to be biodiversity and climate, which we want to play a part in addressing. Both are two urgent challenges which need urgent solutions. So we apply a mix between technology and politics to get to solutions that bring us to the targets that we need to go to in climate and biodiversity.
Thank you for the introduction. Today we would like to pick your brain about the topic impact. And the first question that is really biting me is how, or do you have evidence or data that shows that sustainability or biodiversity or anything like that is good for the company, good for the bottom line of a company?
In looking at it in a more detailed way, there are many points of evidence arising that the bottom line benefits from sustainability. The first one I mentioned means that the bottom line has to benefit ultimately, because ultimately an exponential model that depends on growth of physical attributes like resources or emissions has to come to an end. So ultimately every company needs to find a solution here. Specifically, there are many examples. So before, you used to think that renewable energies are more expensive than non-renewable energies, fossil-based energies. But today, we have ample evidence that solar power is the cheapest form of generating energy worldwide. So it's no longer the case that the unsustainable solution is cheaper, but actually the sustainable solution, the solar solution, is a cheaper form of generating energy. That's one example. Another example that is commonly used is the performance of companies on the stock exchange. It used to be the opinion of many that sustainable companies have to forego profit because they want to be sustainable. But the more you look at the ratings of sustainability and the performance on the stock exchange, you do see a correlation. So the companies that are aware of the issues around sustainability, they are also the ones performing best. That is not just because they address sustainability issues, but they're the best management teams, and the best management teams address many relevant issues, but also those issues around sustainability. So that's a very concrete example where in the past people have argued, you can't invest too much in sustainable companies because your interest rate will be lower. Evidence is pretty strong already that it's actually the opposite. You have to invest in sustainable companies because they're the companies that are better run, and those companies generate better returns on the stock exchange as well for investors.
At first glance, it seems like a battle of narratives, that the common narrative at the moment is a financial one, that people think, oh, I only need to think about money, and that's the whole thing, the whole point of a company. And everything is set up around that narrative. So we had the impression, we heard much more like that there's new types of companies like not purpose-driven companies, not just built on earning money. And I have the impression that most people will not think like in the global sense that, okay, my company, they will not care about that the resources are finite, but will care maybe more and more on a gritty level. How does my company actually work? And we were involved in a project in Zurich where we tried to build actually a network and try to argue for people that if you do that, if you work together, you get something bigger than when you would work on your own, and look at the whole thing at something more interdependent. But our experience was that very few people actually really found that narrative interesting or thought, okay, there's something to it. Yes. How do you experience that?
Yeah, I think there's a whole number of big issues here. Well, what you mentioned before is a topic very common with many people right now. Many call it stakeholder capitalism, or responsible capitalism, or what have you, where the objective of the company is more than just the maximization of profit, and that this kind of has to be the new narrative, that companies are responsible citizens and that therefore they look at other things than profit. I have a slightly different view to this issue, frankly, because I saw a lot of, fluffy, I'm not sure I'm allowed to use this word, bullshit talk about this subject, because there is, a lot of people who kept on reminding us how responsible companies are, and that we don't need any government to tell them what to do because they're themselves so responsible. But unfortunately, the evidence is really to the contrary. I have done research studies some 15 years ago when I worked for the government of Abu Dhabi. So we looked at way back then, 15 years back, we looked at the question as to what makes companies and countries perform well today and in the future, and we came very clearly to this issue of sustainable development being a major factor for competitive advantage in the future, and then we looked at how sustainable are companies and countries, and how does this relate to the regulatory framework, to the policies that those countries have. And the evidence was very clear. So those countries that had very clear policies, government policies, for example, emission standards that require companies to meet certain emission standards before they just pollute the sky with what comes out of their chimneys, or the quality of the water that needs to be there when the company lets it back into the river. Wherever there was laws like this, the companies that worked in these markets were also much stronger in those fields. So they adapted, they had to adapt, and therefore they became sustainable, sort of out of pressure from policy. And I mention this because I see a little bit two theories here. The stakeholder capitalism theory suggests that companies by themselves have to develop into good corporate citizens, and they should know what is good or bad for society and then do that for society. And even though I'm very convinced there are quite a lot of companies that are very close to this to this dream space, as you could call it, where really there's a management and even shareholders that support this stakeholder approach and live this sort of be a good corporate citizen theme. I think that's very, very much the minority and not the majority of companies around, particularly not if you look at developing markets where people are not having enough of goods and services to consume and keep on wanting more, and they want to grow, and profit is the main thing that gets them to the things that they don't have yet. So I personally I'm not of the opinion that stakeholder capitalism is the solution, but rather I think that one has to think very carefully on the roles that different stakeholders play. And government is a stakeholder, and it has a role, and it represents the people, and it can set the rules that optimize welfare for the people. Government has is the stakeholder that acts for all the people and therefore should know what is good or bad for society and has the right to check whether that's good or bad for society through a vote or through a parliament and things like that. A singular corporate stakeholder has, by law in Switzerland, the Obligationenrecht specifies that it's the duty of a company to make a profit. A company can more or less focus on that role of maximizing profit, but within the legal regulatory framework that is dictated by the government. So a good corporate citizen, in my view, is giving the room to the governments to set those rules and not fight them, because a lot of corporates fight government policy and don't want government policy, and they talk about their own voluntary actions also because they want to keep mandatory policy actions from happening. They say, oh, we don't need those rules. We are doing this anyway. And we have many examples right now in Switzerland. There's the Konzernverantwortungsinitiative initiative, which is very much in this direction. Or you have, in the CO2 law, when I was directly involved with Swiss politics, we always heard those arguments that the good companies are doing it anyway, and that, one doesn't need those rules. I don't believe in the stakeholder capitalism, or only to some extent. If the best corporations act like global citizens and really, look way beyond profit maximization, that is great. That's like the best guys in the class that go for the A grades. Super, we can have them, but that's not the average. For the average, for the market to move, we need clear rules. And to get to those clear rules, that's one of our foundation's core jobs, is to make sure, to one extent, that the companies give the government that space and acknowledge that their main purpose is to maximize profit, but they recognize that there is a rule set in the markets they operate under which they are allowed to make these profits. And it's the government's job to set the rules such that we are all in all, we're moving towards a sustainable development direction, right? So it's the roles that I think are different, and I don't think it's the role of a company to do good to the world primarily. Its role is to maximize profit. That's a legitimate role as long as this profit maximization happens within the regulatory framework that ensures that that profits are maximized in a sustainable way.
Thank you. Actually, with this, you've answered my other question, because I was thinking that normally a business owner would say that it's in his interest to make profits, to maximize his profit, because without profit, his company or her company can't even survive in the future. But you already answered that question.
Mm-hmm. There's some great examples. Let me give. This is a bit of a controversial example, which is very accurate, but I love to give it because really we need to hear. I mean, there's a great example right now in Switzerland. If you look at the company, a very famous company, Lonza, listed on Swiss Stock Exchange, $6 or $7 billion in Swiss francs in turnover, a very profitable, super EBITDA margin in the chemical space. They run a factory in Switzerland. It's called the D29 factory. It stands in Visp, in the western part of Switzerland. As late as February 2020, it was discovered that one plant in Visp, this D21 plant, is emitting 1% of total greenhouse gases in Switzerland. And thus far, nobody has realized that from this chimney in Switzerland, one company is emitting 600,000 tons equivalent of CO2, meaning 1% of Switzerland's emission. So this one company in this one area pollutes so much as 8 airplanes would fly around 24 hours a day. 8 airplanes, 8 passenger airplanes. And not even Switzerland, that is a government with a lot of, administrative power and very well organized compared to other governments, found out about this. And it turns out that this gas that they're emitting is N2O, Lachgas, is not even regulated under the CO2 space. So under the CO2 law, there is no direct reference to N2O. And what makes it worse is, or yeah, you could say make it worse for the company, the company, once they found out, they immediately knew that if they invest $12 million, they would get a catalyst into this chimney that reduces 98% of this N2O going out of this chimney. But instead of installing this catalyst with their own money, and that's 12 million compared to 300 million of turnover they do for the product they manufacture in this factory, and it's compared to 6 billion turnover of the company. So it would be easy for them to get, UBS would love to give them the 12 million if they could only charge 1 or 2% interest. They're a blue chip company, it's no problem for them to get the capital. But what do? They go to Bern and they ask the government to pay for this catalyst. Yes. And up to today, this chimney is still polluting. Up to today. So, I'm just right now organizing with Extinction Rebellion and some other guys to make sure everybody knows. But if you can read the Tagesanzeiger magazine, Christoph Lenz has written an excellent article 2 weeks ago discovering this story. And I knew about the February event already, but I mentioned it. Why do I mention this? Because in the board of Lonza, there's president of Economie Suisse, and there's many other representatives of industry in Switzerland, of the important industry associations. And those people have told me for years that, all the stuff that I'm doing is not really necessary because they would be so responsible themselves. And they don't need those rules because they're responsible capitalists and would do everything themselves to solve these problems. And here we have a huge problem with a little bit of money getting away 98% of emissions. And not even this they do in Switzerland. So nobody should tell me that, in India, where, the environment is really different, this is going to work, that, all these companies are going to say, oh, we're going to all do these things right. And no, it's not going to work. So we need clear rules, and the responsibility alone, unfortunately, is not doing the trick.
But it's going to be then a battle of narratives. So
yes.
Economie Suisse now holds the economic narrative of how you should do business, and this is very different.
Yeah, it's the narrative where they are scaremongering. If we do this, for example, if we pay the 12 million, then so and so many people lose their jobs.
Yes, but actually in this case, nobody will lose the job. I mean, everybody would be more proud to work for Lonza. I mean, if I would work for Lonza, I immediately send my letter of resignation if I hear that I'm working for a company that is so irresponsible. Because if you go to the details in sustainability, unfortunately, it gets messy quite a lot. It's quite complex to get emissions out of chimneys, or quite difficult to make circular processes for products that thus far you just threw away or burned after you used it. And so they're challenging issues, a lot of challenging issues. But in this case, it's not a challenging issue as well. It's a huge company. It's a small investment. It's 98%. So this is a great story for thinking about, how responsible are our companies really? How responsible are management teams of companies that are listed on a stock exchange and have to produce results every quarter? How much time do they have to think about the world, what is right to do and what is not right to do? And another thing which I think in this context is quite important for all those people who think the narrative is right, that companies have this duty to decide what's right and wrong. I would question, on what basis does Lonza know for me what is right or wrong? They don't represent me. They know what's right and wrong for themselves, for their team, for their shareholders. That's right. They can make those decisions. But I don't want Lonza to make a decision of how climate friendly Switzerland should be. That's not their decision. They're just one company working in Switzerland. But the decision on how sustainable or climate friendly our economy should be, that's the government deciding for all the people. So it's the representatives in parliament that were voted for by the people that make that call. They have the right to say what's right or wrong for the country. The companies, they don't know that. Why should they know?
Mm-hmm. Nick, what I'm wondering is actually if your company that has, let's say, a purpose beyond profit, mm-hmm. Is it difficult for such a company to raise funds, to find investors? Because that plays again into the narrative.
if you ask me, does somebody who wants to have a positive impact will find it difficult to get investment? I would say, well, it depends very much on what the proposition is. In some circumstances right now, there's so much money waiting for good impact that many people can come with not so smart solution and talk about the great impact they want to have, and people throw money at them. There's lots of that as well. And I see lots of, sort of strange approaches as a result. But the question implies that it would be easier if you don't have a positive impact to get money. And I think we have to part from this notion. Today, in many countries, you would be right. If you produce steel in India, for lack of a better example, then you probably, it's easier to deal with a bank if you don't build in all these filters and capture all this CO2 that you emit and so on and so forth. You probably get money easier from the bank in these circumstances. But going forward, we have to think about entire economic systems like the Swiss economy that has to work under rules that assure that companies are maximizing profits and getting money for their projects under a rule set that allows the entire economy to be on a path of sustainability. And that's why I think there's a big case. My storyline is the sustainable market economy. I don't want the government to own companies. I don't want the government to even build stuff, but the government has a role of setting the rules, and it needs to set those rules such that companies can maximize profit. With that view, maximize profit inside those rules. But because you have those rules, well, overall development is still sustainable. There's no sacrifice to it. That's sort of the big vision. Short term, a lot of stuff around sustainable strategy and stuff has to do with people and marketing and branding. So it doesn't need to be greenwashing, but a sustainable positioning today already is helping a company getting project finance and getting customers, and the sustainable image and the sustainable strategy for many companies also help them with staff. So if you take the case of Unilever, one of the leaders in sustainable business, worldwide, really one of the key leaders, whose CEO, Paul Polman, the previous CEO, he was the main guy in many conferences speaking for the business community and bringing great examples of what Unilever is already doing. They have great targets that are almost as ambitious as the climate strike movement in terms of CO2 neutrality and things like that. They're really up there. And I had the privilege of knowing Paul Polman and had him on a panel once and was in contact ever since. And he once told me that he gets asked a lot, how can he, as a CEO of a publicly listed company with hundreds of thousands of employees, spend so much time talking about sustainability at the UN and talking about climate change and not washing powder. And he said, nobody is going out of university and think that they want to produce washing powder, or ice creams, or the many things that Unilever produces. So he says, if we want to get the best people, we need to show them that they work for the company with the best purpose. So a lot of my sustainability strategy was sold to the board on the basis of attracting the best people who would not, naturally go to a Unilever, but actually go to a Unilever because they think, hey, that's a company with a great purpose, and I want to be part of that. So he justifies his involvement in sustainability, his positioning, his early positioning in this way. That's a smart intermediary step which companies can and should take right now. But long term, every company has to be sustainable, and therefore governments need to make clear rules that only sustainable business practices are allowed inside those rules. That's, in my view, the only way we'll reach our targets.
Okay. No, from somebody I heard who was involved in many companies who want to be sustainable, they said it's much harder to do it because you have to be better at everything. It's a bit more difficult to raise the money. It's more difficult to build your business model because you have higher standards for yourselves, and the ecosystem doesn't so much support it.
Yeah, it may be right now in some markets and some industries, the ecosystem doesn't support it so well. You're right. I consider this a result of the fact that the policy framework isn't right yet in those markets. And I consider it as part of my job to help make sure the policy framework is as fast as possible good enough and does not make it more difficult, but actually makes it would mean you break the law if you pollute N2O into the atmosphere without paying for it, type of thing. So I think there are ways of changing this around. And if you think about one figure, you know, at the moment you have about 5 times more funding subsidies for fossil fuels, 5 times more than you have subsidies for renewable energy in the world. Even, you know, this fact shows you that currently we don't have no rules, but we have many rules. But many of those rules are shitty. They support the wrong things. Yeah, it's true. I mean, they support the wrong. You remember in Switzerland, there was a rule that you had to rip out the catalyst of a car first because it wasn't allowed to have a catalyst. So the first cars that came with catalysts, they had to take them out in order to be licensed for the roads. Things like that. You really have quite a lot of bad rules around. Therefore, I don't think there's a problem, you know, long term if we get the rules right. But what you mentioned is really the current state still, where the rules are not yet right. So I do sympathize with some of those, you know, with people who make those calls saying it's more difficult right now. But I think it's going to get easier and easier. And things that I'm working on, like a price on emissions, will help, right? If you have a price on emissions, for example, then you need to factor in those costs all along the way, and then it becomes part of the economic equation. You can't just, you know, pollute and don't pay for it. But if everybody pollutes has to pay for it, then there is a clear economic incentive not to pollute. And then if you are in front of a bank manager and he asks you about your new project and you say that, you know, oh, we're polluting so and so much CO2, then he will see, oh, but that will cost you because there's a price on that, right? So I think we have temporary problems now, but there is a long-term solution or a medium-term solution to it. We need to get the policy rules right, and then it will be easier to sell to a bank manager a sustainable project because there'll be less costs if you're sustainable. That's where we have to get at. And that's in this whole context, you know, the neoliberal thinking in Switzerland. There's a lot of this, Avenir Suisse, NZZ, Economy Suisse. They're all agents that are very much along the, you know, let the market rule and let's keep government as far away as possible. We don't need those rules. You know, we're all responsible actors. We need to have free choice, and we do everything on a free will, and so on and so forth. I really think that the time of those guys has come to you know, change their view, because obviously we're not going in the right direction with many things concerning sustainability, like climate, like biodiversity, and so forth. Equality is another thing, you know, big thing. Where those people who are calling for another bunch of tax cuts for rich people, you know, I just think you have to come to terms that, yeah, if you're rich, it's great to have lower taxes, but if everybody around you is poor and goes on the street and fights and you know, is not happy with their lives anymore, then it's not fun to be rich either. So there's a balance to be struck there. But in Switzerland, I find we're in a market because of those actors that still now are, you know, if you see the way the Konzernverantwortungsinitiative is fought right now, it's exactly those same arguments that, you know, companies do that anyway, and yeah.
Okay, but then you say, well, we need more regulation, but I guess this is going to be a political battle and a battle of narratives.
Yes.
Now a little bit more Greens in the parliament, so things look a bit more rose in that way. But like, internationally, is that really happening, that those rules get set that way?
US election just now, it's clear. It was the first time climate was a real issue in the US election. It played part of a role. on the democratic victory. Yes, almost half of the country still thinks, you know, it's great to step out of the Paris Agreement and a guy like a clown like Donald Trump to be president. Yes, still half of the population think that, but a little bit more think there's a better way. But yeah, so yeah, there's going to be a battle, but I mean, in my view, that's the battle we need to fight for. You know, that the French Revolution of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, those values that you didn't have at that time and you really needed at that time because it was just unfair that there was this group that had everything and that group that had nothing. Right now is that same type of scenario happens right now in sustainability, in my view. You know, I see figures now. We have a study that has an emission pricing instrument, and the emission pricing instrument puts a price on emission as the government, and then instead of spending the money by the government just gives that money back to the people in equal shares. This means that everybody needs to pay for emissions. That's great. And those people who don't use a lot of emissions, they still get the same equal share back from the income. And so those who are smart and don't generate a lot of emissions, they pay no fee for emissions, but they still get the same price back. So they profit a lot. And the fascinating thing about this instrument in terms of policy is that if you look at it of the distribution among the whole country, then you see that actually right now it's the poorest people that have to pay for the consequences of the emissions of the richest people. Because the difference between emissions from a poor household in Switzerland, medium to low income, you know, poor household, and a rich household in terms of emissions, this difference is not like 20 or 30% more, but often the richest households have 20 times more emissions than the poorest households. Because, yes, it is surprising, but yeah, and we have hard data on that. And you could just read it by Sotomo. They did a study we are translating into English right now on the airline ticket fee, where the same logic is applied. Everybody pays a price for emissions when they buy an airline ticket, and then the money is redistributed. And then you look who gets the money, and you find, and who has to pay more. And you find that 5% of frequent flyers actually pay for all the other people. And that's the same logic, because if you are a poor family, you have one small car. If you have a car, you live in one small house. If it's not a small apartment, you go to, you know, local travel because you can't afford to go long distance, and you eat rather local food, or, you know, and not, you know, shrimps from Maine every second day. If you're rich, you have a big house, you have 2 or 3 cars, you may have 2 or 3 houses, you may have a whirlpool and a sauna in the house, you may have several TVs that all use power. So you need a lot more of everything. And it ends up as being the richest households 20 to 30 times more in terms of their emission footprint than the low income households. So if you have a system now that charges emissions for everybody, same price, so whoever generates emissions pays the same price for it, you take the money by the government, you split it, you send it back to the people as income, split up in equal shares. At the bottom line, we can show in Switzerland about 65 to 70% of all Swiss households will have more money in their pocket than before. Now that's great, because that means if we get the story right and put it in front of the people, at least those people who think about maximizing profits should vote yes, because 60 or 70% of the people make more money. So why should they say no? Mm-hmm. And so I think it depends a lot on this, but do it in a different way, like Macron did with Gilets jaunes. What did he do? He said correctly, let's put a price on diesel. Correct, diesel needs a price. But what did he do? He didn't do a so-called climate income system where you collect and give back as income, but he did a tax, which means that the poor worker goes to the petrol station, has to pay more for the diesel, end of the month comes, they have less in their pocket, because what Macron does with the money he gets from the tax, he doesn't give it back to the people, but he maybe invests it in schools or in a wind farm or in a new road. And the worker at the end of the month has a problem.
Anything. It has no direct impact.
He has no direct benefit, and the rent still comes, the bill for the rent still comes, so he still needs to have the cash. And if he needs to pay more for diesel and you have a low budget, then you have a real problem at the end of the month. And therefore, the Gilets jaunes movement started. And for me, this is a great example of, you know, Macron wanted to honestly solve a problem, but he did it in the wrong way with the wrong policies. And, you know, to your point before, I'm not suggesting we need more rules. I'm suggesting we need the better rules. It's a big difference, honestly. The better rules, even, I mean, you don't have to speak about places like US or Iran or Saudi Arabia, where fossil fuels are extensively subsidized. So you have the rules for the wrong incentives. But even in Switzerland, you know, you used to be able to deduct every expense you have traveling with your car to work, you could deduct from your taxes, right? That's a negative incentive. So you don't penalize people for sitting in their car and driving to work. They can even deduct it from the tax bill. So you need to cut those type of misincentives, and you get to a system that I think starts to work in a sustainable way.
What would you say to somebody who doesn't believe that and he wants to look at some data? Or...
No, those people who, that's the problem. Those people who don't believe that also don't want to see the data. It's all about story and narrative. And
yeah.
that's my, because I'm, how should I put it? I'm the data-driven person as a programmer. Mm-hmm. And so I have a lot of problems with people who, let's put it, emotionally driven. And this topic that you are mentioning, I think it's more emotional driven. And for me, it's very difficult to find the right narrative and the right words to talk to such people.
Yeah.
Advice.
Yes. I mean, from my experience, you're absolutely right. There are the 10, 20, 30% of people which they don't really want to understand, or they don't want to look at the data to understand. They have a fixed view of the world, and they are very much focused on, they're inflexible. They want to keep on doing things like they do them now, and they fear change. So everything that smells like change for them triggers negative emotions, and they just want to conserve. You know, there's like the typical conservative parties that want to conserve things as they are now. And obviously, you know, this doesn't work. There's maybe 10, 20-year periods where this kind of works, but you can't want to preserve. If you were in the French Revolution and you would say, we're preserving the situation we had then, you cannot preserve that all the way to the 20th century. It's logical, that doesn't work. So at some stage you need to innovate, you need to reform. There's always change in the system. So you can't forever preserve, that's my view. But some of those 10, 20, 30% of the people are in my view in the camp of wanting to always keep things like they were and not change anything. And I don't think there's much point to speaking to those people, frankly, because they're not interested in the data. Yeah, but it's true. I mean, you know, politically, these are the far right, and we leave them shout around there. We don't need them for majorities. We need to fight the battles where we can win them. And I think what always surprises me positively is this gut feeling of Swiss voters, for example. You know, that some things are you can actually bring in front of the people and get the majority behind you. And I think in these topics, I think it will be possible to bring the majority behind you. And there's several reasons why. The positive reason is that it's easier to be sustainable today. Like the solar panels, they are 1/10 of the cost today as they were 10 years ago. So it's easier to go solar now. Or there are many models of electric. When I got my electric car, this was almost the only one around that you could normally drive 7 years ago. Now you have 20, 30 models. So for somebody who wants to drive electric, it's now easier to drive electric. And it will continue to be like that. So on one element, I think it's it is going to be easier to make the choice and to agree to a new law and so on and so forth, because if there is sacrifice short term, it's less than it used to be. And on the other hand, the bad side is that, we'll have lots of reminders. I mean, look at this year. Look at it was the warmest November. We had the biggest bushfires in Australia. We had the fires in California. We had the fires in Russia. We had the floods in India. We will be, and I'm a specialist in this, we will be reminded about where we're wrong. And people like you that collect data will have better and better pots to make decisions from that data, because unfortunately, it is the truth. These things change, and these costs are real, and these things are happening. And if you live in Miami at the beach, you will not find a normal insurance company at normal rates to insure your house anymore. It's not possible, because those insurance companies, they made the math. They see the risks have risen, and it's no longer financially feasible for them to provide you with an insurance. So you cannot get normal insurance if you live on the coast of Miami today. And Swiss Re has to factor in these costs when they insure a new plant, or they insure the insurer over a new plant somewhere in Bangladesh in a territory where there's flooding. They will factor in that risk. This is real already today. So I think there's going to be more and more data and reminding that we need to do something about this. And if Swiss people, like, a summer ago, see helicopters flying water to Alps because it was too dry otherwise the cows would have died. We need to use helicopters to fly water to the Alps and things like that. It starts to get quite extreme, even in good old Switzerland. Or if you see all the skiing resorts that most of them now need artificial snow, and 30–40% of them will not be able to survive in the next 15 years. You see, this is real stuff. It's not just, some crazy guys speaking about it, but it's tangible, real stuff. I spoke to IKEA. I have a lot to do with IKEA right now. One of the reasons that got them going in climate change was the floods in the US. They have many stores in the US, and they kept on getting flooded. And it was really bad business for them, because if the store is flooded, it has to close, and they see it in the sales numbers. So they see that if we want to grow our sales, we need to make sure we don't have any flooding anymore. If we want no flooding, we need to be active against climate change. Otherwise, we'll have floodings. So I think in terms of getting there, we have the advantage that it's easier to be sustainable because it's cheaper and so on and so forth. It's less, it's comfortable. And we have the advantage of getting reminded that we really need to do something, because if we don't, we'll have problems.
Thank you. Let's conclude with this. I think this is a very good point to stop.
Thank you for watching this interview. If you liked it, hit the like and subscribe button. This will help spread the word. You can find more interviews and events on our website. If you're looking for experts in product development, design, digital marketing or programming, let us know so we can connect you to our community. You can find more info on our website.